I told myself to stay calm. Help was coming. It had to be. That's what people say when waiting feels safer than accepting the truth. At first, hope was loud. It kept me alert. Every sound felt important. Every passing moment carried the promise that someone would arrive and say, "I'm here." I waited. Minutes stretched into something heavier. Time stopped behaving normally. It didn't move forward, it sank. I replayed old conversations in my head, searching for assurance. Someone had said they'd check on me. Someone else had promised not to leave me alone. I held on to those words like receipts, proof that I wasn't abandoned. But promises don't echo forever. The longer I waited, the quieter hope became. It stopped standing tall and began to sit down beside me, exhausted. It no longer spoke in confidence, only in questions. What if they forgot? What if I mattered less than I thought? I tried to distract myself. I focused on small things, counting breaths, watching shadows shift, listening for footsteps. Each time I heard something, my heart jumped. And each time, it fell again. No one came. Hope didn't die suddenly. It didn't scream or collapse. It faded. Like a light left on too long, dimming until you don't remember when the room went dark. I realized I had been waiting for permission to be saved. Waiting for someone else to decide that I was worth the effort. Waiting for care that was never urgent enough. And that hurt more than the waiting itself. There's a special kind of pain in being patient for people who are comfortable without you. In knowing that while you are counting minutes, they are living without interruption. I stopped checking the time. Hope was too tired to keep track. Instead, memories surfaced, times I had shown up immediately for others, times I answered calls, stayed late, listened longer than I should have. I remembered how natural it felt to help, how little convincing I needed. And that's when the truth settled in. Help isn't always late. Sometimes it's simply not coming. The silence around me grew heavier, but something inside shifted. The desperation softened. Not because things improved, but because expectation disappeared. Waiting had drained me. But it also taught me something I hadn't wanted to learn. No one was rushing to save me. And strangely, that clarity was sharper than pain. I felt the weight of acceptance. Not peace, acceptance. The kind that doesn't comfort you but steadies you. The kind that says, "This is real, and you're still here." Hope, once loud, now whispered a different message: stop waiting. Not because help was bad, but because my life couldn't remain paused for people who didn't show up. I stood there, not rescued, not relieved, but awake. The waiting hadn't broken me. It had stripped away illusion. I understood then that hoping endlessly can be a form of self-abandonment. That sometimes, the bravest thing isn't believing someone will come. It's deciding to move even when no one does. I didn't feel strong, but I felt honest. And honesty, for the first time, felt like a step forward. I walked away without closure, without apologies, without explanations. Not because I stopped caring, but because I stopped waiting. And in that moment, hope didn't die. It changed direction. After hope quieted down, something else took its place. Silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that presses against your chest and makes you aware of every thought you've been avoiding. I didn't call anyone anymore, not because I didn't need help, but because I was tired of proving that I deserved it. Waiting had taught me a strange lesson. Asking repeatedly can make you feel smaller. Each unanswered message, each delayed response chipped away at something inside me. Not my pride, my certainty. I began to question myself. Was I asking too much? Was I overreacting? Was my need inconvenient? Those questions were heavier than the situation itself. Time passed differently now. I wasn't counting minutes anymore. I was counting realizations. Every quiet hour showed me how alone I truly was in that moment. I remembered how people spoke when they needed something from me. Urgent. Clear. Persistent. They never doubted whether they were allowed to ask. But when I needed something, suddenly patience was expected of me. Strength. Understanding. Silence became the answer. I sat with it longer than I should have. Long enough for anger to show up, but not loudly. It came calmly, like a visitor who didn't need to announce itself. I wasn't angry at people. I was angry at myself. Angry for waiting so long, angry for believing words instead of actions, angry for putting my life on pause while others kept moving. That anger didn't explode. It settled. and in that settling, clarity began to form. I saw how waiting had slowly trained me to accept less effort, less care, less urgency. I had convinced myself that this was maturity, that endurance was strength. But endurance without support is just quiet suffering. The silence around me forced me to listen inward. And what I heard wasn't weakness, it was exhaustion. I was tired of hoping in the dark, tired of explaining my pain carefully so it wouldn't scare anyone away. Tired of pretending that being patient made the hurt smaller, it didn't. Silence stripped everything down. No distractions, no excuses. Just the truth sitting across from me, unblinking. And the truth was this: no one was coming to interrupt this moment. Not with answers. Not with apologies. Not with understanding. And strangely, that realization didn't destroy me, it grounded me. I felt something unfamiliar: control. Not over the situation, but over my response to it. I couldn't force people to care, but I could stop begging for proof that I mattered. Silence stopped being punishment. It became information. It showed me where I stood. It showed me who showed up. And most importantly, it showed me who didn't. I began to see waiting differently. Waiting wasn't noble. Waiting wasn't patient strength. Waiting was a habit I had built to avoid difficult decisions, because moving forward meant accepting loss, and loss is honest. Waiting is hopeful, but dishonest when it never ends. I stood up without ceremony. No dramatic moment. No music. Just a quiet decision forming inside me. I wouldn't chase clarity anymore. I wouldn't wait for comfort that arrived too late. I wouldn't measure my worth by someone else's response time. Silence had spoken enough. I didn't feel healed, but I felt awake. And that was enough to move. When I stopped waiting, the world didn't change. People didn't suddenly appear. Messages didn't come flooding in. Nothing dramatic happened. But I did. The emptiness felt different now. It wasn't asking to be filled, it was asking to be understood. For the first time, I wasn't scanning the distance for help. I was looking inward, unsure but present. Standing alone was uncomfortable. I had grown used to leaning, even when nothing was there to lean on. Letting go of that habit felt like learning how to balance again after a long fall. I moved slowly. Not forward, just enough to prove to myself that I could. Each small action felt heavier than it should have, not because it was hard, but because I was used to waiting for approval before acting. No one was watching, and that scared me more than being ignored. Without witnesses, every choice became honest. There was no one to impress, no one to convince, no one to blame. Just me and the quiet responsibility of deciding what came next. I realized how often I had delayed my own healing, hoping someone else would make it easier, hoping their presence would soften the work. But healing doesn't arrive as a gift. It arrives as a decision, usually when you're too tired to keep avoiding it. I didn't suddenly feel strong. Strength wasn't loud. It was awkward and unsure. But it showed up anyway. I began doing small things without telling anyone. Not because I was hiding, but because I no longer needed permission. I stopped explaining my absence. I stopped justifying my needs. I stopped waiting for responses before continuing my life. And something shifted. The pain didn't disappear, but it stopped controlling the direction I faced. I noticed how much energy I had spent hoping others would notice my struggle. Without that expectation, my mind felt lighter. Loneliness didn't vanish, it became quieter. There's a difference between being alone and feeling abandoned. I was still alone, but I was no longer waiting to be chosen. That mattered. I caught myself reaching for my phone out of habit, ready to check if anyone had finally remembered me. I put it down, not in anger, in awareness. Waiting had trained me to look outward for reassurance. Standing taught me to listen inward instead. I began to trust my own timing, my own pace, my own understanding of what I needed. It felt unfamiliar, like wearing shoes that didn't quite fit, but I kept walking anyway. The world remained indifferent, but I wasn't, and that was enough. I understood then that support doesn't always arrive as people. Sometimes it arrives as resilience, slowly built in moments no one sees. I didn't feel proud. I felt grounded. There was no announcement, no celebration. Just a quiet moment where I realized I wasn't collapsing anymore. I was standing. Not because help came, but because I learned how to hold myself. There was no moment of victory, no sudden strength, no proof that everything had been worth it. What came instead was quieter and more permanent. I stopped explaining. Not because I didn't have words, but because I no longer needed to justify my survival. The need to be understood had slowly loosened its grip. Some people would never know what it cost me to stand back up. And that was okay. I learned that closure doesn't always arrive as answers. Sometimes it arrives as distance, as space between who you were while waiting and who you become once you stop. I looked back once, not to return, but to recognize the version of myself who stayed too long. Who believed patience could replace presence? Who thought loyalty would eventually be rewarded? That version wasn't weak, just hopeful. But hope without action had kept me still, so I chose movement, not fast. Not fearless, just forward. I began protecting my time the way I once protected others. I stopped being available by default. I stopped filling silences that weren't mine to fix. I allowed people to show me who they were, without editing their behavior to save my feelings. It hurt at first, but the hurt was clean. No confusion, no waiting, no pretending. I noticed how light life felt when I stopped carrying unanswered expectations, how peace didn't need permission, how strength didn't need witnesses. I didn't rebuild loudly, I rebuilt correctly. Piece by piece, boundary by boundary, choice by choice. Some days I still felt the ache of being forgotten. Healing isn't a straight line, it bends, circles, pauses. But I no longer mistook that ache for a reason to return, because I knew what waiting cost me, and I wasn't willing to pay that price again. The past didn't apologize, the silence didn't explain itself. But I didn't need it to. I had learned to walk without leaning, to trust steps that no one clapped for, to accept that being overlooked doesn't reduce your worth, it reveals who was never meant to stay. I didn't become harder. I became clearer. Clear about what I allow, clear about what I need, clear about the fact that I will never again wait for someone to decide I matter. I moved forward, not healed, not perfect, but whole enough to continue. And that was enough. I didn't wake up one day feeling healed. There was no morning where the pain was gone, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. What remained after the waiting wasn't relief, it was awareness. And awareness changes you quietly. I understood then that waiting had not only cost me time, it had shaped how I saw myself. Every unanswered moment had whispered the same lie, that my value depended on someone else's arrival. Letting go of that belief felt like setting down a weight I had been carrying for years without realizing it. I stopped replaying the past, not because it stopped hurting, but because it stopped teaching me anything new. I already knew how it ended. What mattered was how I continued. I learned to sit with myself without distraction, without the hope of interruption, without imagining footsteps that never came. In that stillness, I found something stronger than reassurance: self-respect. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind that doesn't announce itself. I became careful with my energy. I no longer poured myself into places that required me to shrink. I no longer mistook familiarity for safety. I began choosing peace over proof, distance over disappointment. Some people noticed the change. Others didn't, and that was the final lesson. You don't need everyone to understand your growth. Some people only know the version of you that waited, and they won't recognize the one who learned to walk away. I didn't close doors angrily. I let them stay closed naturally. If someone wanted to show up, they knew where I was. I stopped standing in the doorway. Life didn't suddenly become easier, but it became cleaner. Pain had edges now. It didn't linger endlessly. It didn't confuse me into staying. I could feel it, acknowledge it, and move forward without bargaining. I forgave myself for waiting so long. Not because it was right, but because it was human. Hope had not been a weakness. It had simply been misplaced. I redirected it inward, where it could finally do some good. I trusted myself more after that. Trusted my instincts when something felt one-sided. Trusted my silence when words weren't respected. Trusted my ability to survive without being rescued. I stopped asking, why didn't they come? And started asking, why did I wait? The answer didn't shame me, it freed me. What remained after the waiting wasn't bitterness. It wasn't hardness. It was clarity. I knew what I deserved, not because someone gave it to me, but because I learned what life felt like without it. And I promised myself one thing: I would never again pause my life for someone who was comfortable with my absence. I didn't need closure from the past, I had direction. And that was enough to keep going.